Keith, you mentioned there were a number of different ways to crown a company. Could you talk about a few of those?
Yeah, I can certainly share some of the characteristics we saw in these companies. One of the things that struck us is these companies were very careful to avoid the trappings of corporate royalty. Often as a company becomes successful and gets to a certain size, the entrepreneurial leaders say, you know what, I've kind of earned the right to have a different set of rules apply to me than apply to the rest of the company. It's a very, very dangerous precedent to set because people disconnect in terms of their level of commitment for the company. I think the second thing that we saw was that at a certain stage as a leader, you really have to shift from the role of commander to the role of coach. And in fact, somebody in athletics said to me this time, why don't more NFL players become great NFL coaches? They never discover the joy of scoring without touching the ball. That's a great, great formulation for business as well. And so you have to shift from commander to coach. You have to kind of fall in love with a new set of practices and a new set of behaviors, which is building your organization. We spend our early years of a business running the business, and we spend the later years, if we're successful, building the business. And the last one I'll mention is maybe a bit counterintuitive, and that's that they were careful not to let loyalty become a liability. One of the things we discovered about entrepreneurial leaders is they're people. They are really great at getting a whole bunch of people committed to them and to their vision and to where they're headed. And often they have a hard time letting go. And sometimes people don't, they just can't grow at the same rate the company does. And we found that the comparison companies were more likely to kind of keep those people in a role where they weren't succeeding. And these 9 breakthrough companies were really, really careful not to let their loyalty become a liability.
Keith, can you give a couple of examples or a little bit more information about making this transition from commander to coach?
It's really tough because one of the things that a company needs early in its life is a decisive driver who can essentially navigate the company through the shoals of startup, which is really, really a tough time. And all of a sudden, you kind of get some breathing room and you have to learn a different set of behaviors. And this is something I see entrepreneurial leaders struggle with more than anything I see, is this struggle from moving from a commander to a coach. And often people who are struggling with it, they'll ask me, well, how do I do it? But it's easy to talk about. It's really hard to do. I'll say, okay, great. In your company, tomorrow, declare an answer moratorium. And they'll say, what are you talking about? Just stop answering questions. He said, I can't stop answering questions. I get 100 people in my office a day asking me a question. Great. Stop answering them. The person says, well, what would that look like? Well, someone comes in and asks you a question, and you say, what do you think about that? He said, and what you'll find is people like to be asked that question, and they'll always start talking. And what you do is you just start following their train of logic. And if their train of logic you think is off a little bit, just ask them questions that nudges them left, or ask them questions that nudge them right. But just stop answering questions. Now, here's a risk, and you have to understand, people are used to having you answer their questions. And frankly, there's a lot less risk involved for them if you answer all the questions. So they're going to be tricky. They're going to try and figure out a way to trick you into answering their questions. But if you're diligent and you're honest and sincere in the process, and you just keep asking, well, what do you think? One of the things that eventually they'll say, well, I can't go in his office and ask a question. I won't get an answer. And guess what? They'll stop asking questions, and they'll start coming to you and saying, I've identified this problem in our company, and this is my recommendation. Because you should always ask them, what do you want to do about this? Empower them to solve their own problems.